Institute 70th Anniversary Lecture Series. My name is Magda Teter, and I'm Associate Director of Public History at the Leo Baeck Institute. I know that more people are still joining, but please let me start with the introduction. So for those who were unable to join us for the first lecture in May, we are pleased to remind you that the Leo Baeck Institute is celebrating its 70th anniversary this year. As part of the celebrations, we have launched a special series of 7 lectures, each exploring one key theme in German Jewish history through the lens of evolving historiography. Today, we are honored to welcome Professor Magda Teter, who will speak on early modern. And please, before introducing our speaker, please let me remind you briefly what is behind actually the main idea behind this series. So historiography, like history itself, changes with each generation of scholars. After many decades in which German Jewish history was primarily framed around major political events and the lives of political leaders, historians have increasingly turned to microhistory, examining the experiences of everyday people, including women, children, and marginalized communities. These newer approaches often focus on struggles, failures, and the broader social fabric that shaped Jewish life. And through this lecture series, the LBI seeks to present a wide-ranging view of 7 major topics in German Jewish history, asking how the way we write and understand this history has transformed over time. And now, please let me introduce the speaker today. Magda Teter is a professor of history and the Spidler Chair of Judaic Studies at Fordham University. She's the author of Jews and Heretics in Catholic Poland, Sinners on Trial, Jews and Sacrilege After the Reformation, Blood Libel, On the Trial of an Anti-Semitic Myth, Christian Supremacy, Reckoning with the Roots of Anti-Semitism and Racism, and of dozens of articles in English, Hebrew, Italian, and Polish. Her essays have also appeared in the New York Review of Books, Public Seminar, and the JTA, and many others. Her book, Blood Libel, won the 2020 National Jewish Book Award, the George Mose Prize from the American Historical Association, and the Ronald Bainton Prize from the 16th Century Society. Her new book, Blood Libels, Hostile Archives, Reclaiming Interrupted Jewish Lives, was published in April 2025. Professor Teter has received fellowships from the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, Radcliffe Institute at Harvard, the Kuhlman Center at the New York Public Library, and others. She's currently the president of the American Academy of Jewish Research. And I could continue with this biography for much longer. So before letting Professor Teter to speak, I would also like to remind you that during the lecture, there is an active Q&A box, and you can write down your question. So Professor Teter, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Magda. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here, although I feel like I am speaking from a perspective of an outsider. I do not come and was not trained in German Jewish historiography, though some of the material that I will be talking about was certainly something I was trained as a graduate of Columbia University's Jewish history program, graduate history program. So one of the things that is very interesting, perhaps for some of people on the audience who might be aware of the critique of the centrality of Ashkenazi Jews or the focus on Ashkenazi Jews, the recent term is Ashkenaz normativity. And this, even some activists and scholars have been talking about the focus on Ashkenazi Jews. It might be surprising that actually the Ashkenazi Jews, and especially German Jews and their culture, were actually held in somewhat in a contempt by early Jewish historians, even German Jewish historians, who instead really valued and extolled the history and achievements of Jews in Arab lands and also of Sephardic Jews and their diaspora, and they held them in much higher regard. So when reading the groundbreaking and very influential at the time and subsequently work by the German Jewish historian Heinrich Gretz, one is struck by the really language of contempt for German Jews in his work. And I'll just want to give you an example. When he was writing on the post-Crusade era, German Jewish history of post-Crusade era, he talked about, as you can see, the Jews had already, even before that, been inclined to extravagant piety, and then with the Crusade and the persecution, they became even more bigoted. And all the merriment of their life has died out. Judaism became gloomy. He talked about the so-called poets of the German Jews. He thought that they were without enthusiasm or taste for any branch of knowledge. The writer and poet Ephraim ben Yaakov of Bonn, he called a skillful versifier. So one of those so-called poets. He claimed that his verses lacked poetical beauty. They possessed no poetical beauty, and he emphasized the isolation of Jews from Christians, being shut up in their own circle. Their sense of euphony of language became blunted, he wrote in one of his chapters. And then when discussing the persecution and the badge, he talked about the impact of the badge that Jews were forced to wear. Worse than the outward dishonor, he said, was the inward influence of the badge on Jews. Jews became more accustomed to their ignominious position, lost all feeling of respect, of self-respect. They neglected the outward appearance. They became more careless in their speech. They were not admitted to cultured circles. And in their own midst, they could make themselves understood by means of a jargon. They lost all taste and sense of beauty, and to some extent became as despicable as their enemies desired them to be. They lost their manliness and courage. And just to give you a contrast of what how he then saw the Sephardic Jews, because he sometimes, when he discusses Sephardic Jews, he brings back the contrast with the German Jews. So he talks even here as he discusses the persecution of Sephardic Jews, their exile. He talks about their elastic force, that they carried their heads as high princes, the Spanish pride, their distinguished manner, right? You can see the different language. They cherished and cultivated the Spanish manner so lovingly, in full vigor. Contrast this to the lack of manliness that he discussed when he talked about German Jews. They considered themselves a privileged race, the flower of nobility. The Sephardic Jews, looked upon the people among whom they settled with contempt, and so on and so forth. And he talked about the language. Jews spoke the languages of their native country, and took part in literature, right? On equal terms, with manliness and without fear of servility. And on this point, he says, they contrasted with the German Jews, who despised pure and beautiful speech, the very thing which constitutes a true man, and considered a corrupt jargon and isolation from the Christian world as proofs of religious zeal. Um, so and then when he discusses the influence of German Jews and German Jewish culture as the German Jewish diaspora expanded to Italy, or some prominent rabbinic families like the Asheri family moving to Toledo from Germany, he essentially saw it as detrimental to those cultures. So when he discussed the Asheri family, the German family, as I mentioned, who moved to Toledo in the 13th century, Toledo in the 13th century in Spain, he said that they introduced to Spain, quote, a one-sided Talmudical method of instruction, deeply tinged with a gloomy ascetic view of religion. Their ideas were very narrow. They were ignorant in other subjects. They possessed every quality calculated to bring the decay of religion in accord with the increased suffering of the Jews. And in the Italian case, they indoctrinated the Italian Jews with their prejudice and narrowness of vision. And just as the Italian Jews were making determined effort to free themselves from the bond of the Middle Ages. You get an idea of that kind of language, and that goes through to other centuries as well. But Goethe's concept of Jewish history was that focused on Jewish suffering, the history of suffering and learning. So once, because he had little respect for German Jewish learning, because for him the paradigm of highness, the glory of Jewish culture, was in the Islamic lands and in the Sephardic context. Um, when that learning was gone and the suffering set in, then there was really not much for him to carry. So there were other books that were later written about German Jewish history. In the late 19th century, Kohut wrote a German Jewish history, for beautifully illustrated German Jewish history, carrying from the settlement during the Roman time until modern times. But the Goethe's idea that the pre-modern period was this period of gloom, darkness, isolation became very influential. So when the Leo Baeck Institute was founded 70 years ago, in 1955, and then founded the Leo Baeck Institute yearbook that was promoting scholarship on Jewish history. The interest in Jewish medieval and early modern Jewish history was really not there, but also the founding of the institute and the yearbook came within a decade of the enormity of the destruction of Jewish life in Europe, and that was what Jews and German Jews who founded the institute were really grappling in. But then, nonetheless, they wanted to study history. So the Leo Baeck Institute and its focus came to be German Jewish history, but mostly modern history. And here you have in the sort of the exposition of the Jewish history as we see it by Selman Speer, who was a German Jewish lawyer. He fled Nazi Germany and settled in Mandatory Palestine in 1936. And he talked about how difficult it is to be objective in history. And he talked about, tied into the ancient historians who themselves some of them were refugees or were deportees. And he said they passed judgment on their time while describing its development. And he says, on that account, it is impossible to investigate scientifically and to describe the last 200 years of German Jewry without being stirred by violent emotion. The Jew who attempts this task today is the survivor of a gigantic catastrophe. The civilization to which the German Jews belonged was destroyed with them, not by external barbarians, but by the uncivilizable German underworld, which had attained political power, right? So essentially, everybody who was writing German Jewish history, Speer argued, was a survivor in one way or another of this catastrophe. Um, and what Speer proposed as a sort of questions of research and areas of research was about what was German Jewry, to explain that, what determined its fate, what it achieved, what survived its date. And again, the focus on the period of a vanished epoch, right? There's a sense of ending of something, to chronicle what the culture to which they belonged, um, kind of determined the modern period. And he says that essentially the emancipation of Jews, the attainment of equal rights of Jews, was to be the point of the departure, and the integration of Jews into the modern society. And again, showing how German Jews in the modern era were simultaneously German and Jewish, or Jewish and German, depending on where they put their accent. Siegfried Moses, who wrote the introduction to the first volume and set the agenda, talked about the focus on the external and internal developments and arts, but primarily on the modern period, since the Enlightenment. So here you can see the outline of the research program for the LBI that was then later on reflected very much in the yearbook. So again, from the period since the Enlightenment and the first part is really very much like what we scholars trained in even American universities in modern Jewish history would study. When I collected the bibliography of the LBI, but only from 1963, because that's what's indexed, and I was easily able to get the citations. Here you can see the sort of keywords that emerge from the first decades. And I put the 76 there because there's one of the first articles that deals actually with the medieval period is published around that time. So you can see anti-Semitism, emancipation, political culture. You can see the sort of the questions that were really outlined by the first issue. And then in 1977 and to 1992, 1990s really become the kind of the change in focus of the interest. But you can see again Nazi era, anti-Semitism, and the modern assimilation, nationalism, and so on and so forth, Zionism, as you can see here. But overall, when I expanded it, we begin to see some words related to the early modern period. Very, very few, but nonetheless, they do appear. So the pre-modern period received very, very, very scant attention, but in an interesting way, you can see how the publications also illustrate certain larger changes in modern historiography about the pre-modern era, the medieval and early modern era in German Jewish historiography. So the first issue actually had two articles that touched upon what we might consider the early modern era, but both of them framed it as the beginning of the modern era. So Selma Stern wrote her article covering the period of the Renaissance and the Reformation, and she saw it as quote, not only the most painful, but also, if we accept our own time, the most tragic of German Jewish history. She really, although she focused on the Renaissance and the Reformation, she really conflated the medieval and early modern phenomena. You can see here the sort of very dark view that the folk imagination in the medieval, there was a period of the folk imagination, medieval period of the Jewish creditor who demanded his pound of flesh. That, of course, a reference to Shakespeare. The figure of the mythical renegade apostle Judas was converted. So she sort of focuses on the dark, the anti-Jewish Jewish sentiments, and again conflating some medieval and early modern aspects of that. So it's doom and gloom of the pre-modern era, but then she highlights Yossel Rosheim as this figure who stood up against these new forces. Bernard Weinrib, on the other hand, approached this period from the economic history and touched upon, again, what we historians now see as the early modern period. He saw the 30-Year War that began in 1618 as the beginning of the modern era. And as he says in this article, the preceding century, the 16th century, which is what Stern had written about and published in that particular issue, was no different from the Middle Ages. The process of expulsions of the Jews, the confiscation of their property, which began in the last centuries of the Middle Ages, Black Death, cancellation of debts, and capistrano persecutions, expulsions from many cities, continued in the 16th century. That quote sort of shows you his view of the medieval period as very much in line with what we saw also in Gretz. And it in again, the focus, there was really not much published about the pre-modern period, but there's a very interesting article that comes out by Eugen Meyer in the Leo Baeck Institute. Meyer wrote a book of the Frankfurt Jewish community. He was also its last syndic before the war. And in this essay, he traced tunes from Jewish liturgy to Christian folk tunes from the medieval to the modern times. So he is the first one to sort of make this connection. And he acknowledged in that article the coexistence in the same country of two national groups, however different in size and tradition, is bound to leave its mark on both. And the history of Jews in Germany offers an ample evidence of this interaction. And he talks about the sort of mutual influence, but obviously stronger among Jews. And he talks about this kind of assimilation must have proceeded on a considerable scale. The word assimilation was typically used for the modern period, but he uses it to discuss the early modern period and medieval period some way. But he still sees the influence of German, whether tunes or other aspects of German non-Jewish culture, Christian culture, in terms of intrusion, not in terms of exchange or embeddedness, the way we, as I will show you, we think about this process today. Then in 1973, we have the first explicit article talking about the Middle Ages, but again, back linking it to contemporary times and contemporary modern history. And that's why by Hans Liebschiitz, who was a German Jewish historian, but a medievalist, whose work has not really focused on Jewish Jewish history, and he proposed that the two eras, the medieval and the modern, have both contrasts and continuities. And he sees that in both the continuities, that in both eras, Jews were seen as outsiders, but they had still close links with their environment. So again, we're seeing a departure from Gretz, who saw Jews as completely insular and not connected to German Christian environment. But he saw, again, he comes through from the perspective of the recovering, or the dealing with the Nazi era, and he looks back at that at the modern times from the perspective of the medieval, as he says, medieval foundation of Western society, the ambivalence of Jewish existence in Western civilization, and he sees to some extent as the 20th century German experience as some way of return to the medieval experiences through those continuities. And this is actually an interesting thing, because Weinrib, back in this article that I discussed, he actually warned against looking at history through the lens of the Nazi destruction in this period. It was really in 1988, the article by Menahem Schmelzer on the Hebrew publishing and Hebrew printing in Germany from 1650 to 70, that we begin to see a pushback against that narrative that was so defined by Gretz, and then that echoed through the other works written later. And Menahem Schmelzer explicitly said that we need to move away from this dominant narrative, that this period, the early modern period, was inward directed, self-content, stagnant, and rigid. And we should stop looking at it only as a kind of a twilight zone that is regarded as the end of the vanishing Jewish Middle Ages. He called for a systematic and extensive study of the intellectual life of German Jewish community in this century before the modern times. He thought that such study could lead to a substantive change of this perception as a twilight of the Middle Ages, or stagnant and rigid. And he said, like, the century was filled with amazingly important events, and it therefore deserves attention on its own. So again, he also pushes back against Weinrib, who sees this period, the 17th century, as the beginning of the modern era. And he says, just looking at the phenomenal development of Hebrew printing in a relatively short period of time in so many cities in Germany is a testimony to the vitality of Jewish culture of the time. So he really changes, he really pushes that. He says further competent and detailed research into the diverse aspect of the history of Jewish book in Germany and in the period before the emancipation may reward us with many new insights and with a reappraised image of the intellectual profile of modern German Jewry. So again, against Gretz, who saw the German Jewish culture in this period as nothing more, as he wrote, as insipid. Where I have that quote, I didn't bring it to you earlier, as insipid compilations of previous works, and yet the Leo Baeck Institute yearbook still continued to focus on the modern period. In the reappraisal of the German Jewish historiography, Reinhard Rürup talked about how the Jewish historiography has changed, but nonetheless, it was a historiography of an insight into the emergence into modern society. and the end of separate, self-contained Jewish history, right? So again, that idea that the pre-modern was separate, self-contained, and the modern became increasingly integral part of German Jewish history. That is still the view in the 1990. There were a few articles in the 1990s that discussed the early modern period. Alicia Karl Bach and Todd Endelman published an article about German Jewish converts. Joseph Davis talked about called for a focus on Ashkenazi, more broadly defined Ashkenazi intellectual history. And but the first kind of explicit focus on the early modern period comes in the in 2002, where the Leo Baeck yearbook publishes a full section devoted to the early modern period, to the Jewish Alltag, to everyday life in the early modern period. So you see here we have an article by Rachel Greenberg on the shapes of memory, looking at the material culture and the cemeteries, using cemeteries in a very different way than it would have been previously, discussing Jewish rituals, Avir Bar Levav, conversions to Christianities, marriage in Baroque Germany, very sort of focusing on Jewish life in a certain way. And then in 2010, we have yet another section that emerges from a 2009 LBI sponsored workshop in Jerusalem that talks about overlapping spheres, Jews and Christians in early modern Germany. And we have, again, scholarship about Jewish anti-Christian invectives. So this is one thing that begins to change in the 1990s, really for the first time, already in 1961 with Jacob Katz's book, Exclusiveness and Tolerance. But of looking at Jewish attitudes towards Christians, for instance, we begin to see a scholarship on that. We see scholarship on women in the early modern period, like Deborah Kaplan's work here. Yiddish is no longer seen as this despicable, stunted jargon. We begin to see more scholarship on Yiddish in Germany, and even criminality. Jews and crime, something that would have been a taboo and something not to be touched on because it would have been seen as contributing or justifying Jewish, anti-Jewish sentiment and anti-Semitism. And then a year later, we have another issue on Jewish life in the early modern period. The medieval period is not getting any attention in the LBI yearbook, but the early modern period is was getting more traction. And here we have again another set of articles that comes in at this about travel, about movement, about architecture that we see in this period. And then there is nothing. There's pretty much nothing. This is the last kind of set of articles that emerge in this period, but it doesn't mean that the LBI does not forgets that the impact of those articles that we've seen and the scholarship that really came out in the 1990s, 2000s, and the last couple of decades is reflected here in the Shared History Project. 1700 years of Jewish life in German-speaking lands. 19 of the 58 objects pertain to the history of Jews before 1800, and they really treat that on the experience of Jews on their own as they were. So just to sort of begin to wrap up the overview, the pre-modern Jewish history in German lands or German-speaking lands really has evolved from the sort of gloomy and contemptful view espoused by Gretz to a much more vibrant and much more nuanced focus. So we begin to we moved away entirely as scholars from the narrative of isolation, from the lachrymose history that was certainly the move was shaped by Salo Baron's a push against the so-called lachrymose conception of history, to present it more in accordance with historical truth. And we begin to see the not just influences and on Jewish culture the way some earlier scholars saw, but we tend to look at it as cultural exchange, church cultures. In early 2000, Ivan Marcus talked about Christian Jewish the symbiosis. Elisheva Baumgarten argued that we should talk about appropriation, that is making something one's own. That is, Jews are again much more embedded in Christian society, and therefore they share culture, they appropriate, they make them one's own the culture of the dominant society. And you see that in scholarship by many, as I mentioned, Elisha Baumgarten, Ivan Marcus, Ephraim Shoham Steiner for the medieval period, early modern period. We see Elisheva Karlbach's work, Deborah Kaplan, Joshua Teplitsky, and others that whose articles we've seen were published in the LBI issues that I highlighted for you earlier, that really see this pre-modern period in very different way with much more structure. Then we also begin to think about the differences between the Islamic lands and the cultures that were so extolled by the earlier Jewish historians, and the difference between the culture of Jews in the German lands and the Ashkenazi world is less as a result of cultural isolation or the level of integration, but much more in the qualitative difference between these cultures. That is, the Islamic society and the intellectual interests of scholars in the Islamic world were markedly different from what was happening in medieval Christianity. And if we begin to see that Jews are participating in those surrounding cultures, we are now understanding why German Jewish or Ashkenazi Jewish culture, medieval culture, is different from that of Jews in the Islamic land. So we are not, scholars would not judge the way the earlier historians were judging them. Jews' culture, cultural and legal economic integration. Again, we see Jews much more embedded and integral to the societies, and we no longer see that as a characters of the modern period alone. The Jewish community is studied now as also a function of the early modern state structures, as embedded, as functioning, that not just as a tool of the Jewish community, and some scholars called it a state within a state. It was both an anti-Semitic characterization of the autonomy, Jewish autonomy, and also by historians. I've written about this as more of a delegated governance rather than self or internal governance in this way. We see Jews much more participating and integral to the economy, and again, much more culturally embedded as well. So, so Jews are much more holistically seen as being part of European, and sometimes the word European in scholarship is still seen as Christian, but I want to really talk about this European culture as a multicultural and multi-ethnic, multi-religious. That Jews are now being seen as, and German Jews are much seen as part of European culture, even in the pre-modern period, rather than encountering quote unquote European culture only in the 19th century, as many scholars, including Robert Welch, as he put it in the introduction in 1960. So the field has really evolved. Some of the articles in the LBI that I showed you in the 2000s reflect the kind of vibrancy, especially of the scholarship on the early modern period, and I will just say that it's exciting, and get and read the scholars that are mentioned here on this thing. So I'll stop here. Thank you, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Teter, for the wonderful lecture. And we have a few but very good questions. So I will start with one that is very general and pretty overarching, but I think it's a good one. Would you have any thoughts on the relation between evaluation of historiography on Jews in Germany and historiography of Jews in Poland, which is more your specialty?
I think Poland is also the early modern period in Poland was also seen as an era of decline, especially after 1648, and Simon Dubnow really promoted it. But it's interesting. The question is actually quite interesting because at the end of the volume 4, which for Gretz is the end of the early 17th century, before the sort of entrance into discussion of the dawn of the middle, I mean the end of the Middle Ages. Gretz goes and discusses the Eastern European Jews very briefly, and he sees the 16th century as a kind of revival against the doom and gloom and the lack of any value of German Jewish culture in Poland. But then he sees it declines, it degenerates, the Eastern European Jewish culture degenerates. By the 19th century, Eastern European Jews are seen as nothing to praise by German Jews. And this is also something that Bernard Warenweb, who was also writing about Eastern European Jewish history, said, like, German Jews should acknowledge that many of the German Jews were actually immigrants from Eastern Europe. so he pushed back a little bit of that. But I think so in terms of the scholarship, I think that German historiography by German scholars started engaging with German Jewish past much earlier, a little bit, or maybe, but a couple of decades earlier, before scholars in Poland were able to discuss. But still, the sort of the earlier German historiography really also focused on the modern period. It's only in the 1990s that we begin to see that sort of look at the pre-modern era. And in Poland too, the scholarship on early modern Jewish history was much more I mean, in the West, we have, again, 1980s, 1990s, we begin to see the sort of the focus on looking at the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, of complicating that Dubnovian notion of decline of Jews also as insular. Dubno very much saw Jewish history in Eastern Europe as insular, kind of paralleling Gretz's view of the pre-modern period. So they echo. There's a lag, but they are kind of in parallel in this. And we have excellent, vibrant studies of the early modern period right now in Poland going on as well.
And is the material turn in general historiography also present in the more recent historiography of pre-modern Jewish history in German lands?
I'm sorry. I'll take a look at that.
Yeah.
Which
This is
okay.
the question from
No, the
Lenny
material
Shatler.
turn. Okay, the
Yeah.
material turn. Okay, yeah, the material. Yes, I think there is an in. I mean, it's very interesting. Material culture is very difficult in Jewish studies. When we had a few, probably now decades ago, but a few, several years ago or over 10 years ago, and the early modern workshop, which we started in 2004 on material culture. Many scholars reverted back to texts and books and the study of books and the materiality of books. So it's very, but there is exciting scholarship on more broadly on Jewish material culture, early modern culture, both in German Jewish history. And there's excellent work on in Italian Jewish. Federica Francesconi is doing some fantastic, and other scholars on space, spatial history. Scholars are reconsidering space. Again, Deborah Kaplan's work for German Jewish history. So there is definitely both material and a kind of a spatial term. But I think this is important to say the reason why we have this kind of turn and the more complex view of pre-modern Jewish history is because scholars went to the archives. When you only read books, published books, what was published in both by German about Jews in the early modern period, by Christians or Jewish publications. Again, we are now reading it a little bit against the grain, but you see these sort of communities apart. You could arguably say communities apart. Laws are, anti-Jewish laws. This really it seems like these communities were separated. When you go to the archives, it all changes. Jews are in places where you're not supposed to be, right? Deborah Kaplan's book on Strasbourg, Beyond Expulsion. Jews are not supposed to be in Strasbourg. They're not supposed to be in Strasbourg archives. They didn't live in Strasbourg, yet they are in Strasbourg archives. There are all kinds of other work, again, that material culture is another aspect. Once you look at that material culture, you begin to see Effie Shoham's article on the debate in Cologne, on the synagogue in Cologne, and it lets you complicate that. Shalom Sabar's work on Jewish and Vivian Mann's work on Jewish material culture show that there's much more, again, embeddedness and shared culture that Jews were part of rather than a part of.
This is very fascinating. I will only add that actually the story of Jews in Strasbourg, what Professor Teter just mentioned, is also featured in the Leo Baeck Institute's shared history project that is still available online if some of you would like to check the story. So the questions are actually coming. I'm not sure if we'll be able to ask all of them. However, one question. Were there not major differences between the rural Jewish communities and the urban Jewries? That's a question from Lincoln Square Synagogue.
So it's interesting because we tend to think about Jews in the early modern period, especially in the German lands, as urban. Mostly because we have the major communities, the ghetto in Frankfurt, the Jewish communities in Worms, Hamburg and Altona. But as scholars have shown, the majority of Jews actually lived in either smaller towns or in rural areas, right? They were connected to the larger communities, but they lived in rural areas. And that also has implications for understanding Jewish embeddedness, interactions, the way their relations between non with Christians, and when when you begin to be aware of that, when you read, even classical texts, you begin to see the culture in very different ways. So the size of towns, the villages, the fact that Jews live as neighbors with Christians, it changes. It really pushes back against that idea of isolation and lack of shared culture that we've seen in the earlier historiography.
I also noticed that in our audience, we have also Dr. Miriam Tulin from the Center for Jewish History. And she just asked a great question. It's slightly longer than the others. So maybe everybody can just read the question and Professor Teter can answer.
So I'll read the question.
Yeah.
So I have Miriam, and I'm sure she can answer that question better than I have, because she is in the field. I have the impression that the historiography of Jewish early modern period correlates very strongly with the trends in general European historiography. In other words, as long as there was no attention for the early modern period as an independent epoch, there was no such awareness and interest in in Jewish studies too. What would you think? I would say that also Natalie Zeman Davis, not least with her Glickl book, contributed greatly to the awakening and interest in the period. Moreover, the interest in the conversion, families, and childhood. I think that is a very good point. That from the 60s really a kind of an awareness of the early modern period, not just as events like the Renaissance, like a cultural kind of development, or the Reformation, which were of interest and were studied before, but more of an epoch. And I think we the and for Jewish historiography in particular, I think we should really credit George Mossey's book on Europe in the 16th century, which is now coming out in a new edition, for which I wrote a foreword, a critical introduction, looking at that book when it appeared in 1968 and now. And he talks about Jews as being part of that story. He talks about cities. He talks about it's a very different way. So he and his co-author were really conceptualizing the epoch in a new way, not just as a period of wars or of reformation of the religious questions between two Christian groups, but more of a kind of a social history. So once you introduce the questions of social history, which is what the 1960s, 70s begin to take European historiography to, you are more likely to begin to notice Jews, and you are more likely also that historiography were Jewish historians of Jewish history were part of that process, right? They were now by the 60s, 70s, they were trained in universities. They were not coming like grads from outside, because they were not part of, they were part of the academic world. So I think they're definitely participating in those developments. A very good point. Thank you for that.
Okay, and so you were also talking, this is actually my personal question. So like you were talking about those major dates in in the historiography on early modern. So you mentioned 1988, and then you mentioned 2002, and also 2000. Also, sorry, I have problems with the Zoom. Yeah, also with the 2010. And you mentioned that in 2010 we have like new topics: health, leisure, women. Some of them. Is this is part of that also that a new generation of historians actually joining the cohorts of scholars and their new and fresh approach to the topic?
Yeah, definitely. We have a new generation of historians. Again, Jewish studies is part of larger and academic enterprise. So it is no surprise that historians of the Jewish past will be animated by these questions. So Menahem Schmelzer's article, 1980s, comes at the heels of big debates about the impact of print on European culture, right? So the there is definitely part of that, and the material turn or the spatial turn or the interest in leisure. That's kind of a move, and it's also part of the move away from the so-called lachrymose history, right? Which sometimes has been misinterpreted as denial of Jewish suffering, but more frequently scholars are beginning to pay attention to other aspects of Jewish life and Jewish historical experience. So definitely there is a new generation of scholars who have been engaging with that and working on that. And always remember, there's also a lag between between the period when something is being written and something is being published. So that those trends start really in the 80s, and then 80s and 90s, and then we begin to see the fruit of that in the late 1990s and in the 2000s in particular.
So I also have to say that when actually seeing the list of people attending this event, I see many historians, but I also see people who are just interested in that topic. And I think one of them just asked a question. Is Alan's book, The Pity of It All, a good book to start learning about the modern history of Jews in Germany, or would you recommend a different book?
So I have to say that I am not familiar with the book. I apologize for that. But please reach out and I'm be happy to share any other books, and I'll take a look at this one.
Thank you. And last, I see our time, the lecture and the event is for 1 hour. So maybe just one last question, which is actually very interesting for me. So you mentioned that after 2011, there is the big gap or a big missing no articles anymore about the early modern. So what happened, and what's going on?
There were really, again, the Leo Baeck yearbook is interested in the modern Jewish experience in general. So there were different topics, different as a scholarship. The field of modern Jewish history is far larger than the field of early modern Jewish history. So I don't know whether scholars simply have not been submitting to the LBI, but the work certainly has been published in other journals of the more general scholarly journals like the American Historical Review, Past and Present, and AJS Review, and others, JQR, many other journals. So the scholarship on medieval and early modern German Jewish history is certainly published. It just was not published in the LBI, and I don't know why, whether it was simply scholars were submitting their articles elsewhere, and there are only so many of us, or whether there was another reason why they were not published in the LBI.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Professor Teter. And for our audience, as a reminder, the next lecture will be on religion, and this will be by Laura Batnitsky, and this will be on July 30th. Please join us. And thank you very much for attending the event today, and have a great day.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.